Okay, so in the first video on Romanticism, we've looked at the what. What is Romanticism? What characterizes it? In a way, this time we want to look at the when. When was Romanticism, and use that also as a way to contextualize it in political history and see where Romanticism relates to the politics of its own time. So to start with the when, that is of course, as often in these questions of periodization, a debate where there are long and short answers as to the temporal extent of Romanticism. To start with the beginning, now the most expansive answer to this would be to say that actually the aesthetic revolution that I tried to summarize in one of the videos, which was in the mid-century of the middle of the 18th century, that is really this tipping point, this turning point where a lot of the things that will come out in Romanticism are prefigured. So we often also talk about the late 18th century as sort of a pre-Romanticism, proto-modern Romanticism, and so on. Then, of course, political developments do play a large role, as we will see. The French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, 1789, plays a major role in crystallizing many of these developments and accelerating many of these developments. So that could be a way to think in terms of the beginning of Romanticism. This is also when Blake publishes his Songs of Innocence, a core document, but Blake, as you will see later, is a little bit of an outlier in that respect. And the most narrow version of the beginning of Romanticism in England would be 1798, the literary revolution that comes about with the publication of this collection of poems, lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So that for many other writers was sort of a rallying point to read these poems, and from that moment on, literature changed for many people. So we have kind of a moving beginning that looks either at large-scale developments in aesthetics, or at political developments, or at specific literary texts proper. Now, when we're looking at the end of Romanticism, again, we can take different reasons for the end of Romanticism. This is usually a little bit more condensed in terms of the range when we assume Romanticism to have ended. Most literary histories end the period of Romanticism with a political act, 1832, with the Reform Act. And this, the Representation of the People Act of 1832, commonly known as the Reform Act, was an act of Parliament that introduced changing to the electoral system of England and Wales. This was something that developed as England changed throughout the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Manchester grew extremely, but their representation in Parliament was still very limited. So in order to address some of these problems and others, the Reform Act was sort of the outcome to change the electoral system. And many historians credit the Reform Act with launching the modern democracy in Britain. So that's not a very good literary reason to end Romanticism here, but many of the issues, the political issues that concerned Romantics, changed through this act. But also, of course, this was the year the death of Sir Walter Scott. So we have this sort of coincidence in this respect. And then, of course, particularly in the British context, we have in 1837 the accession of Queen Victoria as the new queen, who will go on to reign for a very long time, all the way into the earliest 20th century. And then, of course, we talk about the Victorian age when we talk about most of the 19th century. So we have kind of a clear cut-off date when something new starts, which doesn't exist in the same way in other countries, for example. We can, of course, also look at some of the major figures. What we can notice is that in the 1820s, a lot of the central figures like John Keats, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron die in the span of just 3 years. William Blake dies in 1827. So by 1832, a lot of the major figures aren't there anymore, although that is also contingent in that Wordsworth gets very old and lives on into well into the Victorian age, and only dies in 1850. So if Romanticism starts with Wordsworth, we might actually say, well, it ends with Wordsworth in 1850. But by that time, aesthetics have changed, politics have changed. So we usually say Romanticism really happens in the last years, starting in the last years of the 18th century, and goes on into roughly the 1830, 1832. But this has already shown us how strongly our idea of Romanticism as a historical movement, something that happens in time, how strongly that is tied to political developments, which might at first seem surprising, since Romanticism is often thought of as rather either apolitical or less political than other comparable literary movements. And indeed, it often moves away from direct social analysis that we had on a much more straightforward way in Enlightenment thinking, in rationalist discourse, in neoclassicist discourse. But the romantic individualism that I've tried to develop in the first video really is at the core tied to the political ideal of revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy. In a way, we can say this is the apotheosis of these ideas of liberty and individuality and rights that are being developed in all the way to the French Revolution. And that's one of the reasons why the French Revolution as an event is really seen to be such a trigger for romantic movements and developments all throughout Europe. And that is why it makes sense to look at a French political event in history as a major turning point for British literary figures, really. It is the most important event for understanding at least the politics of romantic writers. One thing we have to sort of imagine when looking back at the year 1789, that the French Revolution really seemed to announce not just one isolated political event in another country, but rather a large-scale movement towards freedom, towards equality, and against oppression and against convention. And that is very important to see this moment in time when this happens. So for those who experienced the French Revolution even from afar as it was happening, this was really a beacon of hope. And Wordsworth, in his autobiographical poem, the Prelude, when he looks back at this, he expresses this very nicely in these lines. "Oh, pleasant exercise of hope and joy, for mighty were the auxiliaries which then stood upon our side, we who were strong in love." This idea, there are many with us, we're not alone. This is a growing movement. "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." So this really nicely captures this idea of how great it is to be alive in a point of revolutionary change, and then if you're even young and you feel like you can participate in this is very heaven. Not favored spots alone, but the whole earth, the beauty war of promise. What temper at the prospect did not wake to happiness unthought of? The inert were roused, and lively natures rapt away. And most of the the first generation of Romantic poets was swept up in this and really was inspired by these developments. This is the time when the two poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, actually developed this idea that they would go on, that they would emigrate to America, and they are found their own colony, which would be ruled by pantisocracy. So a kind of a proto-communist ideal society. Pantisocracy, of course, means equal or level government by and for all. The idea was that there was not going to be any personal property. Everything would have been shared. There was also sort of hints of notions of free love involved in this. So this was really, we're going to go there and we're going to build this, basically this great commune and install a perfect society on Earth. Now, it didn't come to pass. The plans fell through. But we see sort of a spirit that emerges in this with these writers as they're young. And we will see they change their ideas quite a lot as they grow older. Because it's really very important to remember that when these writers experienced the French Revolution as it happened, they didn't know how it would turn out. They didn't know the full development, and that is something that then emerges as they continue to observe what was going on. And actually, many of them then even went over to France, like Wordsworth, to experience the revolution for themselves. But then, as the years go on, of course, this idea of promise and liberality and freedom turns somewhat darker. This enthusiasm sort of needs to be seen together with the shock of the later developments. 1792, when King Louis XVI is actually executed, and also this is when the Revolutionary Wars start to break out, and this is when France declares war on England. So that leaves the radical thinkers and writers in England in a tight spot, because they want to support the revolution, they want to support France, but this is also at the same time a country that is officially at war with their own country. And then, of course, in 1903, 1904, there are these internal struggles within the revolution, and there's the so-called Reign of Terror, when between 16,000 and 40,000 people are being killed, many of them through public executions, and there is really sort of this unimaginable level of violence that, of course, runs very counter to this original spirit. And then from 1799 onwards, we have the rise of Bonaparte, and even an end to the very spirit of the revolution, as it turns from this sort of democratic, egalitarian society back into an absolutist monarchy in many respects. So Wordsworth, after noting how blissful it was to be alive in that dawn, then goes on to describe the feelings of what happened when the revolution really turned bloody. Domestic carnage now filled the whole year with feast days. Old men from the chimney nook, the maiden from the bosom of her love, the mother from the cradle of her babe, the warrior from the field, all perished, all friends, enemies of all parties, ages, ranks, heads after heads, and never heads enough for those that bade them fall. And this really was sort of the great disillusion for those, particularly for those who had hoped so much for the revolution, because they experienced that disappointment in the revolution. And that's one of the reasons why the older writers, the first generation of writers, started out radical, but very often sort of turned rather conservative in their later development. But the effect is very different for a second generation of writers who are some 20, 30 years younger than the originals, and they never experienced the French Revolution as it happened. So they didn't have the same kind of personal disappointment, but they kind of held on to the ideals of the revolution and rather saw their the first generation that they saw, that they looked up to in terms of their younger writing, they saw them as falling from their own ideal position, to see them as kind of lost leaders, and we find that often in texts by the younger generation, that they address these earlier writers as sort of failed father figures. You can see this, for example, here in this text by Shelley, which is addressed to Wordsworth. Thou hast like a rock-built refuge stood above the blind and battling multitude. In honored poverty thy voice did weave songs consecrate to truth and liberty. So that was good old days when you had nothing, you were poor, and you sung for truth and liberty. But deserting these, thou leavest me to grieve, thus having been that thou should cease to be. So you're not that anymore. Byron characteristically is a little bit more sarcastic about this when he writes about Robert Southey, the very man who originally wanted to create this proto-communist ideal society in America, and then went on to turn around completely and become a reactionary. And before that, he was honored by the post of poet laureate as the official poet of the king. Byron, in the dedication to Don Juan, makes fun of Southey here. Bob Southey, you're a poet laureate and representative of all the race, although 'tis true that you turned out a Tory at last. Yours has lately been a common case. And now, my epic renegade, what are ye at, with all the Lakers in and out of place? So generally speaking, the development, particularly the development in France, but also to an extent in America, a few years earlier in the War of Independence, brought with it what we would call a radicalization of politics also in England, in that more and more writers demanded more radical reforms. And this is actually where the term radical in its political meaning comes from. It was originally used by the parliamentarian Charles James Fox. In 1797, Fox declared for a radical reform of the electoral system. And this led to a general use of the term to identify all supporting the movement for parliamentary reform as radicals. Now, the government, of course, had several ways to react to this, and of course they were highly nervous about everything that happened in France, where the people had just overturned their government and started killing them off, basically, and abolished aristocracy and so on. Now they could have gone in the way of reform and say, okay, let's give in a little bit, but actually they went the other way around and tried to suppress any kind of radical thinking that emerged in the 1790s, which is really the period of radical political thinking in England. And they tried to control all of that and really repress any kind of political agitation. For example, through the so-called Seditious Meetings Act of 1795, which meant that you needed a license for any meeting in a public place that consisted of 50 or more people. If you wanted to have 50 or more people in one place, you needed to have a license from the government. So it was basically a way to make it impossible to have large-scale gatherings, to have demonstrations, and so on. And then throughout the Napoleonic Wars, the government took very stern measures against any kind of domestic unrest. So it was really very much a crackdown against all of this, which did not eradicate radicalism, but rather meant that sort of the fronts would get harder and harder, and radicalism would really develop as throughout writing and agitation at the time. I can't, of course, go into the whole history of political developments at the turn of the century. One later rallying point in this development was the so-called Peterloo massacre of 1819. This was when, so we see we've moved on a few years, and there was still agitation for reform, and there was a large-scale demonstration. And in order to quell that protest, cavalry charged into a crowd of 60 to 80,000 people that had gathered to demand the reform of parliamentary representation. So they charged into that with sabers drawn, as you can see here in this image. And in the ensuing confusion, 15 people were killed and 400 to 700 were injured. So that became sort of a symbol of this repressiveness of the government against this, and many writers reacted to this, none more so than Percy B. Shelley. And Shelley writes some of the most clearly political texts from English Romanticism, and one of those is his sonnet England in 1819, which you see here in its entirety. An old, mad, blind, despised and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring, rulers who neither see, nor feel, nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop, blind in blood, without a blow. A people, starved and stabbed in the untilled field, that's Peterloo. An army which liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay. Religion Christless, godless, a book sealed. A senate, time's worst statute unrepealed. And all of these are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. Now this is very obviously, basically sort of enumerates everything that is wrong with society till he comes to these last two lines. I just want to use this as well to show how the Romantics in formal terms, we haven't talked a lot about formal matters yet when it comes to Romantic writing, but you can just imagine that since this is all about breaking away from convention, about the organic, about the unruly, about the non-confined, that formal constraints wouldn't play quite the same role as they did, for example, neoclassicism. I try to show how formal rules are really sort of an exemplification of what this is all about. Something similar happens with this, but here it is actually the breaking of the rules that is part of the message. So I already gave away in the beginning that this is a sonnet. We know that, or we can assume that this is a sonnet mainly by counting the lines. If you count the lines of a poem and it has 14 lines, you can be 99% sure that this is going to be a sonnet. And then if it's a sonnet, it has to have a certain rhyme scheme. There are several different rhyme schemes that it could have. We've talked a little bit about this in the context of the Petrarchan sonnet in early modern English writing. But one thing that's common to all of them is that they start with two quatrains, so 2 times 4 lines that somehow have a rhyming scheme. Now, of course, we can do an analysis and see which lines rhyme which lines, and then write this down, and it would look a little bit like this. So it starts quite okay, A, B, A, B. That could be a quatrain. But then it goes on A, B, C, D. So here we have 4 lines that none of which rhymes. So that's nothing. That's not a quatrain. That's not a tercet. That's not a couplet. That's just 4 lines that don't rhyme. So A, B, C, D. And then we have C, D, E, and E, F, F. Again, this is very, very... there doesn't seem to be any sort of structuring to this. And no kind of regularity. So we might ask ourselves, what's happening here? Did Shelley not manage to write a proper sonnet? Did he know what a proper sonnet looked like, and what went on here in this area here where everything seems to be wrong? And no matter whether we see this as two quatrains or three quatrains and a double line at the end, none of this works. The only thing that actually works is if we turn the whole poem on its head. So that would mean that we read it from the bottom up, and then we have, as you can see here, we have FF, EE, DC, DC, and then we have BAB and ABA, and that's okay. You can that's kind of a two tercets that you can do. So it works as a sonnet, but only if you turn it around completely. Now, if we relate that, of course, to what the poem is about, it's about society and everything that's wrong with society. And the way it is constructed is that it starts at the top. It starts with a king, with this great line of monosyllable words, an old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, and then works its way throughout the ranks of society to get to these two lines that all of this are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst. And this phantom is, of course, the liberty, the equality that might come, but it might come out of revolutionary change. And then if we, of course, we can note that revolution, the word revolution, actually comes from the Latin word of turning around, right? To revolve. So what is needed is a revolution. We need to turn things on its head, and then the king shouldn't be at the very top, but rather at the very bottom, and the people should actually be at the very top. So we see how it's not like the Romantics sort of cast out structure and formal matters completely, but rather by going against convention, they established new meanings also throughout form, and that's hopefully a lecture for how Romantics use form. It's not like in some modernist forms where all kinds of formal constraints are being torn away, but rather it's a very careful play with forms and enlargement of what forms can express.